All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Ernst van Sail, here to shine a light on the goings on down south, and here to join me with that shining light and to give you some clarity on what's going on here, and maybe even give you some clarity on how we got here. Is Professor Koos Malan. You will definitely recognize him from a recent episode on this channel called The Coming Deserts of Disorder. It was a magnificent, fantastic episode. I really enjoyed it, and I know the audience enjoyed it as well, judging by your comments. And therefore, because it got such a good reaction, and also because Professor Koos Malan is constantly producing new pieces of knowledge from his pen, I felt we had to invite the professor back on the show to discuss his latest piece that we will be getting into. But firstly, just a little bit of context. If you haven't watched the previous conversation that we had, or a little bit of background on Professor Malan, he is a constitutional jurist of Pretoria, and his publications include Politicracy, an assessment of the coercive logic of the territorial state and ideas around a response to it. And then also one of his recent books, There is No Supreme Constitution, a critique of statist individualist constitutionalism. Welcome back on the show, Professor. I'm really looking forward to it.
Good evening, Ernst, and good evening to our viewers. It's a great honor for me to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
All right. So let's get right into specifically what I wanted to talk about here today, and that is your recent opinion piece, Professor. It was published in PoliticsWeb. I did share it widely on social media. It got a very good reaction, but there's a better alternative than reading the piece, and that is actually being able to ask the author of the piece different questions regarding it. So the piece is called No Longer Seen as Saviours, and within this piece you argue that the civil religion ushered in by the ANC government in 1994 has bit the dust. And I think it's a very timely piece. I think it's very relevant to our times. And if I may be as bold as to make a prediction, I think it will age very well like a fine wine from the Boland region here in South Africa. So I'm looking forward to getting a bit into the ideas discussed in there.
Thanks. Ernst, the civil religion that was ushered in back in the beginnings of the 1990s, was actually ushered in not only by the African National Congress, but in a sense it was ushered in by the entire liberal world. Now that might sound strange, because obviously the African National Congress is not strictly and squarely part and parcel of the liberal world. But what happened was that in 1994, when South Africa finally said goodbye to apartheid, more specifically and more correctly called white minority government, and started off with a new dispensation, it was a new dispensation which, formally speaking, that is with reference to the terms of the constitution that was adopted and that entered into force in 1994, was strictly speaking a liberal democratic constitution with some aspects of social democracy in the sense of a number of socio-economic rights. But the basic characteristics of the constitution was a liberal democratic constitution. Now, there are various reasons why one could in fact term this the ushering in, the heralding of a new civic religion. But let me explain the historical background of that. Most certainly, it's not that necessary to explain that to the viewers, but let's perhaps just refresh our own memories. Back in 1993, I think was the date, the very important and much talked of book by Francis Fukuyama saw the light of day. That was The End of History and the Last Man. I've just reminded myself once again of the title of the book. Now, in a nutshell, the basic thesis of the book argues that the ideological history of the world has basically come to a close, in a sense that liberal democracy has finally triumphed. and that there was no other alternative, no other challenger in the ideological field that could convincingly challenge liberal democracy. Earlier in the century, there was National Socialism that was finally was finally triumphed over in 1994 by liberal democracy, but
Yeah,
not liberal democracy.
excuse me, Professor. It's 1945. You mean the end of
What did I
the
say?
Nazi regime? 1994.
Oh, sorry, 1945, obviously. Well, some people would, in fact, regard 1994 as a much more important date. I'll just now explain that. Okay, that was 1945. Then came the final fall of the Soviet Union and Soviet communism, which was actually the final and last convincing challenger of liberal democracy, which came to an end when the Soviet Union came to an end in the beginning of the 1990s, 1991 to be exact. So, according to Fukuyama, liberal democracy after the fall of communism has finally triumphed. The only problem, even though he did not specifically dealt with that in his book, was that strange maverick ideology with its which was standing on its last legs, and that was back in it was South Africa under apartheid, South Africa under white minority rule. According to Fukuyama, just to refresh our memories a little bit more, there would be some strange challenges of liberal democracy, but not convincing challenges. Maverick dictators here and there, a strange and very unconvincing ideology here and there that, strictly speaking, doesn't make much sense, and that would soon be bound to just dissipate, simply because liberal democracy was too strong. So, as I said, there was the triumph of liberal democracy, but the only maverick exception to that, still in existence, was inequality, racial inequality, in the sense of the apartheid regime, the apartheid government that was still in existence then. However, soon after the book was published, the apartheid government also came to a close. That was in 1994, and now hopefully I've got the date right. That was in 1994, and everybody was delighted because of that. Everybody
the final
was delighted
opponent of liberal democracy.
Exactly. Everybody was delighted, and what enhanced the delight was specifically the fact that it was so unexpected, because the strife and the conflict that was prevalent in South Africa for not only for decades but for centuries, basically since the beginning since 1652, when Jan van Riebeeck first set foot on the southern tip of Africa, there was, to a lesser or larger extent, and more often to a larger extent, racial conflict, racial tension. So it was really unexpected that this extremely difficult problem, this unintractable problem, this problem that could not be solved, so it was thought by many people, perhaps by the vast majority, specifically also in the West, finally came to an end. It was so unexpected. It was regarded, and that's actually a very important word, it was regarded as a miraculous event. It was regarded as a miracle. Now, together with that, the constitution that set out the terms, that defined the terms of the triumph of liberal democracy in South Africa, was concluded in the constitution. And precisely because the constitution set out the terms of liberal democracy, that was also the reason why the South African constitution at the time, the interim constitution, then soon afterwards succeeded by what we incorrectly call the final constitution of 1996, entering into force in 1997, and which is still in force at the moment. That was the reason why it was described as very, very often, on numerous occasions, as the best constitution in the world. If you go to a law student
almost
now,
a holy document. No, I want to say
so.
it took on
if you go and ask any, If you go and ask any student, any law student that was a law student in South Africa in the 1990s and also in the past 20 years, he or she would tell you that his lecturers have told him or her that this was in fact the best constitution in the world. There was no argument about it. There was no comparative study that was done. The comparative method that should have been followed in order to come to such a bold conclusion was not set out. It was just presented as a fundamental, unchallengeable truth that this was the best constitution in the world. And my point is the essential reason for that being preached, for that being pontificated, was precisely because South Africa was at that stage actually regarded as the epitome of the triumph of liberal democracy. And that was one of the strong reasons, one of the most important and convincing reasons why the South African Constitution of 1994 and 1996 eventually assumed the character of a civil religion. As a matter of fact, if one considers the contents of the South African constitutional discourse, even already before the interim constitution entered into force in 1994, you could see that all aspects, all characteristics that one would normally associate or identified with religion, more specifically Christian religion, was actually implanted in the South African constitutional discourse. So obviously it was a secular document, and obviously all people involved in it and all institutions involved in it that have to flesh it out and had to give content to it. All of them were only people. All of them were secular. But the point is, something completely different was made of it. What was made of it was in fact a religion, a civic religion, as I call it, and not only as I call it, but it was. This is actually a topic that has been written on, that has been discussed on many occasions by people like Eric Vogelin, like Karl Schmitt, and numerous others. So this phenomenon of a civic religion, even though it reached kind of a zenith in South Africa in the past 20, 25 years, only now abating a little bit. And I think in times to come, it will completely abate and will completely eventually dissipate. But the phenomenon as such, namely of dealing and of perceiving of ideology, and specifically also of constitutions, as if they are actually some kind of religion, and all the things surrounding it, presenting it as a kind of religion. That is quite well known. But in South Africa, it really reached a zenith precisely because it was accompanied by this broad claim of a general triumph of liberal democracy worldwide. And we can go on in response perhaps to further questions into the details of one why could clearly and convincingly argue that it assumed the nature of a civic religion.
And Professor, there's a line there at the beginning of your piece that I think is very prescient, and that is you've touched on it now, where you write. The advent of the new constitutional dispensation in 1994 was accompanied by pontificating a doctrine of salvation, a soteriology that has been the South African state's civil religion, which since then has been sermonized with such a zeal. Now, there's a very strong idea of salvation, but before we get to that, you actually also mention in your piece the new phenomenon or increasing phenomenon that we see in South Africa, where black politicians use apartheid as a rhetorical weapon against the ANC. We have top, very high-ranking politicians in South Africa using the type of rhetoric akin to things were better under the previous regime, or that X or Y, or this aspect was better, or we need to return to this type of aspect of the previous apartheid regime. We get all those are just examples of the type of rhetoric we're increasingly seeing. But why specifically is this such a devastating rhetorical weapon against the ruling ANC regime?
Yeah. The reason why I deem it as of such importance is the following. The Constitution has its own historiography. In other words, it has its own take on the nature and course of South African history. In terms of that historiology, which, by the way, is also to a certain extent comparable to the Christian view of history, in a sense, is that previously there was some prehistorically there was some kind of paradisical situation that was then followed by a big fall, a sin. Okay, as a result of which the paradisical situation came to a close. That happened in terms of the historiography that was prevalent, and to a certain extent that is still prevalent in South Africa, but which is now under pressure. That's the point. That came to a close as a result of the fall, and the fall was brought about by colonialism, the coming of Westerners to South Africa in 1652, a long period of dreadful sin almost, in which the wonderful paradisical situation was completely scattered, in which the equality and abundance and the mutual love that was supposed to be in place before 1652 was brought to an end, and which was then marked by this 3 centuries or more of dread, of inequality, of lack, of want, of, by and large, of sin, and of exploitation and of conflict. That was then brought to an end in a miraculous way by the Constitution. Okay, and the Constitution set out the terms of the miracle. So the Constitution, in a sense, was a soteriology. And let me just say something about the word. Some of our viewers, even though many of them would be first language English speakers, won't know the word. I'm not looking down upon anybody, because I actually was made aware of the existence of the word by 2 colleagues with doctorates in theology. It comes from the Greek word soter, and obviously my pronunciation is not correct, which means savior. So that's the study of salvation, or then the act of salvation. So this is so when you speak of soteriology, you speak of a doctrine of salvation or a doctrine of redemption. So what the Constitution did was to announce and to usher in, to herald in 1994 the salvation after the dreadful history of the preceding 300 years and more. Okay? So, in other words, it was not something that was only proclaimed. It was not something that was only debated politically. It was not something which was only playing out in the sphere of normal political debate. Since it was a miraculous salvation, it was something that took on the nature of a religion. It was something to be believed in, something to abide by, something to follow. And I'll explain just now all the other aids that were actually invoked in order to support this doctrine of salvation. But the point is, if you challenge, if you question, if you are skeptical to a doctrine of salvation, you are a heretic. You're not only someone subscribing to an alternative ideology. No, you're an heretic. And the the way in which you can be dealt with, it is the way in which heretics are to be dealt with. And that is very harsh, as we know, through history, be it in whatever religious tradition, be it in Islam, be it in Christianity, and so on and so forth. So the reason then why the African National Congress, the present government, present ruling party in South Africa, is looking so is perceiving so is experiencing, that's the right way to put it, is experiencing this as such a blatant challenge, is precisely because this challenge, this argument that is advanced against the government, saying that apartheid, the white minority rule, was actually better than apartheid, was better than the present dispensation, is not only challenging of the present policy and of the present government, it is actually challenging a religion, the religion that was ushered in 1994 and that has been pontificated since then. That basically is the reason.
And Professor, another thing, you've also now made many of the parallels, but there are many others from your piece that I'd like to highlight, because I think they, especially if you are well versed and and know the South African political environment, you'll see these parallels and they'll make absolute sense to you. So in your piece, you some of the other religious parallels you make is that the Constitution, the Supreme Constitution, was the new holy living word. Nelson Mandela, following a Via Dolorosa of 27 years, was the messiah of the doctrine of salvation. The Constitutional Court was the holy temple aptly situated on a hill in Braamfontein, from where the infallible word was to be spread to the redeemed rainbow nation. And judges were the high priesthood interpreting and preaching the gospel of redemption. They also were the supreme benefactors of the doctrine of salvation's promise of human rights, democracy, and peaceful coexistence. Now that we've laid out this foundation, I mean, it's this was pretty much what everyone, the euphoria that many were feeling in the 90s and maybe even early 2000s. South Africanism or rainbowism was at its peak, as you also mentioned. I remember it also specifically. I mean, there was a time where even critique of the ANC would have had you labeled a racist. Times have definitely changed. But what has changed? That's actually my next question, is we've now described what happened in the 90s, what was the order of the day. But what has caused this downfall? What has brought us to where we are now in 2023, where this civil or civic religion that you describe in your piece is a shadow of its former self? It's almost incomparable to the strength and power that it had 30 years ago.
Yeah. Ernst, may I, before answering your question, and I love to answer it, would love to answer it, but just mention one or two additional things. We also had what I called and described in the piece as a pilgrimage. Many people, and specifically from the liberal world, that came to South Africa, especially from the from liberal American sphere. I might mention specifically of one person, and that might sound a bit ad hominem, but it's simply what happened. There was one person coming to South Africa by the name of Professor Karl Clare, one among many American academics on the left and in the liberal sphere. And he also published an article on so-called transformative constitutionalism, which was prescribed at, well, basically all law faculties, not only at my former university, University of Pretoria, but all universities in South Africa, in which this miraculous constitution was actually underscored. He was kind of a pilgrim. He actually led the pilgrimage of many liberal academics, liberal politicians, and so on into South Africa. And his work was extremely important in South Africa. I think it's also important to actually underline that, because in the beginning, in response to your first question, I mentioned that the South African doctrine of salvation. The South African end of history was not isolated. It was part of the general triumph of liberal democracy worldwide. And precisely for that reason, it is important to underscore the link. And the link is in fact underscored with reference to the accolades that the South African Constitution got from people such as these. There's also just something else that I want to mention. It might sound strange. It might sound a little bit artificial also to refer to a judiciary as some kind of priesthood, but specifically in the English-speaking world, and to a considerable extent, we in South Africa are part of the English-speaking world. Also, Afrikaners like me and you, we are part of the English-speaking world. It has a tremendous influence. And it's specifically in the Anglophile world, more so than in the Anglophone world, more so than, for example, in Europe, that judges are regarded as people of an extreme high status. And precisely also for that reason, on very many occasions, legal academics that I think had made good observations did in fact refer already over the past century or more to the judiciary of the highest court as a kind of a priesthood. So when I describe them in that way, it is not something kind of out of the blue. It is it actually follows the course of a well-known discourse and a well-known take that has already been done in relation to the judiciary. So what has happened, to come to your question, is simply that the way in which, and I'm going back to the religious comparison, the way in which the people were regarded, who were responsible for the bad era before the present constitution entered into force, that is, before the miracle, in comparison to the people how people were perceived after the miracle, was wrong. That comparison is wrong. Why do I say so? Well, in terms of the historiography, all people who were responsible and who were important actors in the history prior to 1994 were, to put it bluntly, bad. They were morally bad. And after all, they were responsible for the dreadful history, and it was the reason for the new dispensation was precisely to bring about salvation from what these bad people have caused. Okay, in comparison to them, to these bad people, the new people, the African National Congress, the leadership under previous President Mandela, who was really regarded as a messiah almost, and that's precisely why I say that, and his followers, the government, the senior people within the African National Congress, people who were regarded as the only true representatives of the South African nation. That was what said, for example, in the 1980s and the 1990s, and it's not said anymore. But in contrast to the bad people before 1994, those who were responsible for the morally bad system of apartheid, in contrast to that, these new people were essentially good. So in other words, once again, you have a historiography. Now that historiography has proven in the past 29 years, to be exact, since 1994, to be completely wrong, because the most important result, the most important consequence, the most important thing that we have inherited from the miraculous dispensation after 1994, the so-called miraculous dispensation, is state failure. State failure. At the moment, we are witnessing, and we are unfortunately also experiencing, the African National Congress as the government breaking down the most basic features of the modern state that they inherited in 1994. All the characteristics of a modern, properly functioning state, from peace, from an essential absence of criminality, from a proper functioning infrastructure, be it electricity, roads, railroads, and so on and so forth. All that has basically been brought to a fall. We are experiencing that, and we are living with the consequences of that. The essential responsibilities that a modern government has to shoulder has simply been left by this government. They simply can't, and I think the historical record is clear as far as that is concerned. They simply have proven themselves to be completely incapable of shouldering the responsibilities associated with a modern government in a modern state. It's also not a question anymore of being skeptical about that. The government itself, Ramaphosa, present president, has appointed a commission of inquiry on so-called large-scale corruption and state capture. The reports of that commission, the so-called Zondo Commission, have been published. It has proven beyond a shadow of doubt that this government is indeed failing. Okay, now also very important, what was supposed to happen after the publication of those reports, after they were handed over to the executive, was that the executive would be capable of dealing with that, of giving effect to that. In other words, it was supposed to be the first step of remedial action that should be taken. That is what normally happens, what should be happening. In the meantime, in the past couple of years, the present government, which is another kind of a savior within the ANC, has proven themselves once again to be a complete failure, as a result of which the failing that we have been witnessing for the past 2 decades and more is simply continuing, resulting in all the aspects, each and every single iota and title of the articles of faith of the doctrine of salvation that we have seen since 1994 having been disproved.
Mm. And from that, there's also a natural question that flows, and it actually relates to a interaction that I had earlier today, where some political commentator from abroad, I think he's from the US, said that the ANC is not a socialist movement. They're not a left-wing movement, it seems, is his argument. But I think the central question from what you just described there, Professor, you've described the fall now, you've sketched the picture, but the ANC as an agent within that fall, what is the ideology that's driving them? What is the ideology that sits behind all their decision making that determines how they react to the balance of forces? What type of a movement is the ANC, really, to boil it down to a simple question from what you've seen from your own understanding of history and your own understanding of the ANC?
Yeah. The ANC perceives of itself also as a kind of a savior. That's actually very important. Precisely for that reason, it has easily fit into old-style Marxism, which, by the way, has a kind of historiography which also fits into the kind of historiography, as explained at the beginning of our discussion, set out by Francis Fukuyama. The communist historiography also proclaims that sometime in the prehistoric age, there was a wonderful paradisical situation. Then there was some kind of big fall, resulting in inequality and dread. And eventually that would come to a close, thanks to a communist revolution that was supposed to take place, but which has never taken place, and which obviously are not ever going to take place. Why not? Because, well, we are human beings. Precisely for that reason, we are not capable of establishing such a wonderful, almost heavenly situation on earth. Now, but the ANC basically cherishes the same kind of historiography. They were strongly influenced by communism, and precisely as a result of that, they've also served themselves with a whole barrage of terminology, which is essentially kind of communist kind of terms. They, for example, would speak of very often of a national democratic revolution, which come from the textbook of Soviet communism. In terms of that, well, first there had to be some kind of liberal revolution, eventually to be rounded off by a communist revolution, and then a classless situation, as Marx has once sermonized. So that's the one important clue to actually understanding the ANC. I often use the word transformationism. I just have to explain in a minute why. The ANC themselves, even though in their own policy documents, even though they often refer to the National Democratic Revolution, in following the example of the old Soviets, the more the term that has more currency is actually transformation. Each and every policy document, each and every policy that they would pursue would say, well, this is transformation. We have to transform the South African situation. Recently, for example, new policy has been announced, in terms of which all employers in South Africa have to completely redesign themselves, in terms of which they must not be able to employ people who are actually suitable for a particular position, but they have to employ people which, in terms of the racial preference of the African National Congress government, has to employ. And that is also something that has to take place in terms of the policy of transformation. Right. Now, I call it transformationism. Why? Well, if you use the word transformation, you are basically using a word which purports to describe something. But we're not only here dealing with something which is descriptive in nature. We're dealing with a philosophy, ideology, and consequently the ISM should be added, transformationism. And in a nutshell, that means the following, which is precisely the same meaning borne by the National Democratic Revolution. And that is, firstly, there has to be a strongly centralized government. Democratic centralism, also old Soviet policy. This is also very strongly subscribed to by the ANC. Each and every center of power, each and every center of authority and influence must be regulated by the African National Congress. They stated openly in their policy documents, repeatedly over the past 30, 40 years. So not only the national legislature, but all other legislatures, the executive, the courts, very specifically added, and they have in fact given, to a large extent executed that. The army, the police, the private sector, and so on and so forth. Each and every aspect of life must be under the rule of the African National Congress in order to achieve what? Essentially equality and homogeneity. Cultural homogeneity and otherwise, and equality then specifically in the economic sphere. So that in a nutshell is what it is what it boils down to. You have to have a centralized rule in order to hammer in and to execute homogeneity and equality. But there's something else I should add, because there's something else that I should add, which specifically also which is on the niveau of ideology, which is not often proclaimed. It is not articulated so much by the ANC, but they're actually executing it, and we must try to make sense of it. I call it new primitivism. Let me briefly explain. A typical feature, perhaps the most salient feature of a modern society, is specialization. We have numerous specialities. Precisely for that reason, we are dependent upon each other. But we also know, in view of the an order, a dispensation of specialization, that you cannot simply employ any person in any position. It must be a person suitable for that position. That is specifically one of the products, one of the results of specialization, which on its part is a consequence of a modernized society, because modernism has brought about specialization. Precisely the opposite applies in a situation of primitivity. In a primitive situation, and I'm using harsh words, I know, but let me not try to be diplomatic. In a primitive situation, you do have a very meager amount of specialization, but not much, not much. More or less everybody within a primitive community, within a tribe, for example, with more or less everybody is capable of doing everything, or all the small amount of things, one should say, which is to be done within that primitive situation, because it is not mechanized, it is not specialized, it is not electronic, there's no proper transport, and so on and so forth. So if you approach society with a primitive mind, you would think that you could employ and you could utilize basically anybody in any position. That is a primitive mind in action. And what we've noticed in the past 10 years, 15, 20 years in South Africa is a kind of a primitivism which is actually at work. Precisely for that reason, numerous people have been appointed in the public service, in so-called SOEs. I should explain what that is. State-owned companies, for example, our electricity utility, in the transport services and so on, have been appointed in those positions, even though clearly they did not have the qualifications, neither did they have the experience to be appointed in that position. I know this is, I stand to be possibly be crucified for saying so, but I think what we have are actually two things here. On the one hand, you have the proclamation. You have the government subscribing to this kind of Marxist ideology of transformationism, of the national democratic revolution. However, it is in a sense balanced by this mind of primitivism, which has caused what I've briefly described in 10, 15 minutes ago in response to one of your questions, and which other people are capable of explaining in much more detail, much more convincing, which we have in South Africa, this downfall of the South African state. This, in a sense, the new primitivity, which you increasingly have, and which you first had in the public service, which was the first front in which these policies, this combination of transformationism and new primitivity was actually at work. And what we witness now is that the government actually want to expand that also to South Africa's excellently still functioning private sphere, the private economy, and so on. So I think those two things, I actually like to introduce those two things. Not only the Marxist kind of policy and Marxist kind of conduct, which is normally our only take on the casting light on why things are going wrong in South Africa, and also our only take on elucidating the ideological makeup of the ANC. But that is not the only one. It's actually balanced out by this kind of new primitivity that I've just tried to describe.
Yes, and also, Professor, something that stood out in your piece was the reference to Carl Schmitt, actually a thinker that is not often referenced within the South African political analysis scene, but I think whose writings are quite relevant. But maybe within how you referenced his writing and work within this pattern of thought of yours, could you elaborate a bit on why you chose him specifically as one of the thinkers that you think are particularly relevant to these phenomena that you've been describing up till now?
Yeah, in one sense, I regard Schmitt as very relevant. In a very important sense, I regard him as not so relevant. I'll explain that. I'm actually very glad that you've asked the question. You see, I think the very first reason why he's so important is specifically because he highlighted the question, just like Vogelin, that each and every modern time ideology in the final analysis boils down to something which claims to, or that at least assumes the nature of something which is sacred. In other words, it becomes religion. And I think the reason why Carl Schmitt, which for a long time was kind of forgotten, but which in the 1990s, whose works in the 1990s, especially, well, middle of the 1980s, have been rediscovered, especially in the United States. Not so long ago, I read a wonderful book by a professor of Yale, whose name for a moment I've forgotten. I'll just now remember it, which is a very good commentary actually on Schmitt, amongst others dealing with that question. At the same time also, another reason why Schmitt is important is Schmitt dealt with the question of sovereignty. Now, the question of sovereignty is very important in the sense that when you deal with sovereignty, you're dealing with the, so to say, the wholeness, not wholesome, the wholeness of the state. In order to maintain a state, sovereignty has to be guarded over. The moment a government loses sovereignty, the state actually is falling apart. Now, there's a long discussion that we can go into in precisely how Schmitt discussed that against the background of National Socialism and so on. But it is precisely in this regard that I think Schmitt was actually, and I don't blame him for that, was also, at least is not so relevant for our present situation. Extremely relevant as far as the civic religion question is concerned, but not so relevant as far as the constitutional and political dynamics are concerned. Let me explain. In my second book that you made reference of, There's No Supreme Constitution, I try to deal with the question of how does a constitution change. With your permission, I'll quickly deal with that.
Yes.
The normal liberal doctrine says, and that was actually part of the miracle, that it's also actually written into the Constitution, South African Constitution and all modern liberal constitutions. A constitution can only change through amendment, and I have to emphasize the word amendment, of a provision or provisions in the Constitution. In terms of the prescribed amendment provisions in the Constitution itself. Okay? In other words, in the absence of such a formal amendment procedure followed by Parliament, or in the United States, followed by Congress, you can amend the Constitution, very difficult, has been amended in the United States 27 times, but very difficult to actually amend it. I say, that is actually wrong. That is a very limited perception of how a constitution can actually change. The only way in which a constitution can change is not through amendment. A constitution, more importantly, specifically in a politically dynamic situation, also changes simply as a result of political conduct in essentially two ways. In the first instance, you can have a scenario of widespread failure to comply to any specific constitutional provision, as a result of which that constitutional provision simply falls by the wayside, as a result of the fact that it is not applied. It falls into disuse. Now, that is not acknowledged by liberal constitutional doctrine. Liberal constitutional doctrine's response to what I've just said would be, no, but this cannot happen. because it flies in the face of essential constitutional doctrine. My response to that is, no, it can happen. Possibly it may not happen. But that which may not happen does not necessarily describe what does happen or what does not happen. So one has to focus upon the actual events on the ground, so to say, in order to establish what the actual constitutional condition is, and that might, if one considers that, then you might see, and there are many such examples, that some constitutional provisions have in fact fallen by the wayside. Then secondly, you actually get something which is much more important, much more extreme, and which is very important in South Africa, and that is the phenomenon that you can have conduct contrary to a constitutional rule. Let me just emphasize, contrary to a constitutional rule within a constitution that purports to be supreme. Yes, you can have that. You can have conduct contrary to that by people believing that their conduct is indeed right, by law that it is right. So they're actually acting in accordance with an alternative legal rule which exists in their heads in terms of an alternative ideology that you can also have. That, the first one I refer to as lapsed law, more specifically than lapsed constitutional law, and the second one I refer to substituting law, and that's what we have in South Africa. And I think in the situation in which Carl Schmitt wrote, the situation was simply not such that he was confronted with a kind of historical scenarios where he had to grapple with those kinds of things. But as a constitutional jurist for the past two and a half decades in South Africa, I had to grapple with that and had to make sense of what's actually happening. And if one compares what was actually happening in political reality with what the Constitution proclaims, then you see, well, there's a complete misfit. And the misfit is not the fault of what was happening. The misfit is a misfit as a result of what the Constitution purports not only to say should happen, but is in fact happening, but is not happening. It simply doesn't come to pass. So the point is, therefore, that part of the miracle which is and part of the salvation which is disappearing is simply law, more specifically constitutional law, the terms of the articles of faith, which is simply falling by the wayside as a result of the fact that you don't have the necessary political forces in terms of a government, in terms of a public service, in terms of the courts, and so on and so forth, which can make true what the Constitution proclaims to have brought about. In some cases, it is very negative, and in some cases, it is very positive. Let me quickly mention two examples. In terms of the Constitution, in terms of the constitutional order, government is obviously responsible for law and order, for public safety. In South Africa, as a result of the coming a part of the South African police services, this is not happening anymore. Private security in South Africa is way stronger than the police services. People are actually looking after their own safety and security. This is what is actually happening. So if one compares what is happening in life, in the streets, in the suburb where I'm living and where we are living, and many other people are living, if you compare that with what the Constitution in Section 200 up to Section 205 proclaims in relation to safety and security, you see that the Constitution has, to a considerable extent, fallen by the wayside. There's now a new constitutional reality in place, and that is a new constitutional reality providing for, to put it that way, that private citizens in South Africa, organized private citizens in private security organizations, private security companies, and so on and so forth, neighborhood watches and so on. They are responsible for their own safety. There's also something in addition that one has to point out. If that is so, and it is so, then it implies that the South African government, even though they want to be in control of everything, is slowly but certainly losing control. It is governing over less and less. When you're a government, you have to govern over something. There must be something in relation to which your acts of governance takes place. Okay? If the most important aspect of governance is the police, is safety and security. So that implies that you must have a proper functioning, effective police services. The people must be competent. There must be vehicles. There must be proper safety in relation to firearms, and so one can continue. Okay, it's not there anymore. So it's an interesting thing. We would normally say that a government would lose, a ruling party would lose government when a new party is elected. That is true. We would also say, well, a government loses government when there's a coup d'etat. That is also true. None of that is happening in South Africa. Possibly next year the ANC would be voted out. I doubt that. I think they're going to lose 2 provinces. I think they're still going to lose the Western Cape. And KZN, I hope they also lose the Gauteng province, which is the economic hub of South Africa. But I don't think they're going to lose to be replaced by opposition parties nationally. But there's also a third way in which you can lose, in which a government can lose its governmental functions. That is simply that the objects in relation of which you are governing are dissipating. This is precisely what is happening in South Africa in relation to such a very important question as safety and security. Second example, electricity. This government goes out of its way to try, in terms of its policies and ideology of transformationism and centralism, to keep control over electricity. That's extremely important. If you keep control over electrical power, the generation of power, then you are in a position to govern. If you lose that, you lose government. The prediction at this stage, at the pace of which green energy is being generated at the moment, increasingly, by 2025, 2 to 2.5 years from now, and 50% of power generation in South Africa would be done by private institutions, green energy, wind, solar, and so on and so forth. Once again, losing government without a coup, without an election, but simply losing it because that over which it has to exercise governmental functions disappears. What happens in relation to the Constitution in that regard? Well, it simply falls by the wayside. And together with that, also the Articles of Faith.
And our previous conversation that I talked about at the beginning of the stream, the coming deserts of disorder, that you can find on my channel, there we actually go into detail as well. That's specifically what Professor was talking about there, the disintegration of the state's power to control its territory and the collapse of its influence and its pretty much the collapse of its capacity to rule, its capacity to exercise power. Professor, I just want to say good evening to Colonel Chris Wyatt. He's tuning in from the UK. I see he was saying here that he's listening all the way from that island. I see Colonel Chris Wyatt says good evening from the UK. Well, goeienaand Chris, lekker om vir jou te sien. Prof, the last question, I've left the most difficult one for last, but you are not a person I know that shies away from difficult questions. And that difficult question comes from someone in the audience, Martin Cronje, who asks, I think we all agree that the government is failing, but how do we continue? So basically, put another way, what is there to be done? What does the future hold? And what can we do from our side as individuals, communities, households, organizations? What is there to be done?
the answer is more or less everything. And I think we are, in fact, capable in South Africa, thanks to the fact that we have a very lively civil society, and specifically also private sector, to actually conduct more and more of the functions which traditionally have been associated with the state. Now, let me just allow me to repeat that. I'm not saying state functions, because what we tend to do is to say, well, certain functions are state functions and state responsibilities. That is, in fact, not true. We have, over the last 50 or 100 years, identified or associate certain functions with state functions, which is not to say that they are really state functions. They are just as a result of a history of 50, 60, 70 or 100 years being associated with the state. And they can easily, well, perhaps not so easily, but they can in fact revert to various sectors of civil society, which through the last two examples that I've mentioned is proving in fact to be happening. Let me say two things in that regard. Hopefully it's a acceptable answer. We are not going, and I know it's an upsetting thing to say, we're not going to save South Africa. It's impossible. There are simply not sufficient pockets of organized civil society in South Africa all over the country to actually achieve that. That's impossible. However, it is perfectly possible to in the first instance, save, because in many places in South Africa, we still have areas, towns, suburbs, even bigger areas, even districts, perhaps even as big as a province in the Western Cape, which are still under good control. No question about that. In addition to that, you have certain sectors in the economy, certain sectors in civil society, and specifically certain sectors of the broad South African population, such as, for example, I think the Afrikaners. But not only Afrikaners, it also includes quite a wide variety of black communities, but not black society in general, not society in South Africa in general. Specifically, those communities, we have to distinguish here between communities and general society. Those communities which are well organized, which pool their resources, which have a certain minimum amount of capacity, of proficiency, and so on, are in fact, to my mind, and I think it's already showing, perfectly capable of not only saving themselves and the communities, bring about not only pockets, but areas of excellence, safety, and growth, and civility around them. So I think, if not all, almost close to all of our energy should be invested in our communities, and to exploit the tremendous energy which is in fact in our communities, that should in fact be unleashed. I think the energy and the capabilities are there.
Well, I think that's an excellent place to end it, Professor. Thank you very much again for sharing your wealth of knowledge here with me and the audience in a long format. I always find these conversations incredibly insightful, and I know the audience, specifically judging by their comments, always learn something new, and they always have some insights to gain from all the knowledge that you have to share, Professor. Maybe just the last thing, where can they find your work, on what websites? I know PoliticsWeb is a place where you are often published. Where else, if they want to read what you're writing, listen to what you're saying, where can they find you online?
Yeah, Ernst, I think the most important, as far as articles are concerned, you've already mentioned. I am in the happy position that PoliticsWeb usually publish my articles. In the past couple of months, just a little bit, well, in the past year, since the beginning of the year, 7 articles have been published. I'm I'm very delighted, obviously, that it has been happening in English there, in Afrikaans, very often in Rapport newspaper, and also in Litnet, which is a website. As far as the books are concerned, the two books, Politocracy, which is just going to the internet and type in Politocracy. Even only that one word, you don't have to type in the rest of the title, perhaps Politocracy and Koos Malan. It's available for free on the internet, like many other books nowadays. Then there's No Supreme Constitution, is also available on the internet, on Google Books, and a couple of other in a couple of other electronic platforms, and can also be ordered from the Stellenbosch publishers. Ernst, help me with the publisher, please.
It's beyond my reach now, the book. So I won't be able to check.
Would you excuse me for a moment?
Yes, that's fine. While you can go find it, because I think it's very important. I think Professor Koos Malan's works are definitely, if these topics that we discuss here tonight is important to you, then I think there we go. Yeah.
Okay, it's African Sun Media, Stellenbosch.
Right.
But as I've said, it's also, you don't have to get the hard copy. It's available readily on the internet on a number of platforms.
Excellent. And that title there is No Supreme Constitution. All right, Professor, I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you very much again for coming to share your knowledge. And thank you to the audience, for everyone that tuned in. Thank you for your questions and your comments. Thank you for your great feedback as well. If you are new to this channel and you like this type of content, you can subscribe. You can also leave a like. If you want to know when I go live, you can click on that bell icon next to the subscribe button, and then you'll know exactly when I go live. Most of my content is live. And then also, if you want to take part in the conversation, but it's the live stream is over, you can still take part by posting your comments in the comment section. I read all of them, respond to as many as I can. And I hope you all have an excellent week ahead. I see the comments now at the end are streaming in. I'm just going to give you a quick little appearance on the screen before we say goodbye. But yeah, I'm thankful for everyone that shares the content as well. I know a lot of you go on social media like Facebook and Twitter and websites and whatever, and share all these live streams. I really deeply appreciate it. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm just going to take, like I said, a minute just to put some of these messages on screen before we say goodbye. But Professor, I hope you also have an excellent week ahead. And I hope everyone that listened has an excellent weekend. Stay safe. And I'll see you again next week. Same time, same place, Tuesday at 7 Central Africa time. Live next week, I'm going to be talking to a friend of the Afrikaners from Slovakia, actually a subscriber to this channel that I got into contact with, and he's going to be talking to us about Slovakian culture or Slovak culture, and also how they learned about the Afrikaners and why they admire the Afrikaner culture. So cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless.